Very warm welcome to our first fashion talks at AUP in 2021-22 between consumption, criticism and activism, tonight with Zoe Jo Rae on resourcefulness and other quiet forms of activism. So thank you so much for joining us from Norway today. You live just outside Oslo in the woods, as you told me, and it's great to have you here with us. So I will briefly introduce the series and our speaker today. So we are thrilled to have Zoe with us, and I think it's the first time that we have an arborist speaking at AUP. So I'm very excited about this combination of your work between designing and the work as an arborist. So in your design work, you've created this project Hunter Gatherer in the Anthropocene that we'll hear about more today. A project that you embarked on while you were still at university, but in many ways it has continued to evolve and has become a manifesto for your professional practice. So before introducing Zoe further, this talk is being recorded and will be posted online for wider audience and future audience. And you can use the chat if you wouldn't want to pose questions, but you can also pose questions directly to Zoe at the end of the talk. So our lecture series this year is called Between Consumption, Criticism and Activism. And we really want to explore our roles in relation to fashion. So while the industry often relegates us to passive consumers, it's really every day that we all engage in the creative act of fashioning ourselves. More recently, fashion has become a site for activism, ranging from calling out the industry for their practices, but also dressing dissent. And the question we want to pose this year is really, how can we negotiate the contradictory roles we hold between consumers, critics, creatives, and activists? And how can we move from passive to active engagements with dress and fashion? And for this, Zoe is really the perfect opener for this series, and her work fits incredibly well because it combines creativity and criticism and activism. So as a multidisciplinary designer and a European tree worker, qualified arborist, she's originally from the UK, but currently based in Norway in the countryside. Her educational background is sustainable design, and her work really uses design and making to explore the human condition and trigger conversations and actions around social and environmental challenges. So precisely bridging that practice and theory, criticism, activism. And this has led to engagements with community-based projects where Zoe has contributed both conceptually and practically to the development of multidisciplinary spaces and cultural hubs in Oslo. So at the moment, Zoe is currently collaborating with a small group of individuals to establish a space dedicated to regenerative practices. And the aim is really to reconnect Oslo to its inhabitants and with the Oslo fjord and its biodiversity, or really the lack thereof. And Zoe's work has been nominated for and won design awards, both locally but also internationally. So very warm welcome to you, Zoe. Over to you now. And we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. I've noticed already that I was missing a little bit of what you're saying. So if my connection is bad and you're missing bits, please pipe up and I'll try and see what we can do. So hi everyone, and thank you, Renate, for the introduction and the opportunity to speak to you all today. So Renate reached out to me following a talk that I did at the World Hope Forum, and asked if I'd be interested in speaking with you all today. And I sat reading this email in my cabin in the woods outside of Oslo, wearing underwear and a t-shirt and lacking any kind of fashion education, and felt like I'd never been less qualified to lecture a group of fashion communication students. But understanding that embracing discomfort is often a good idea, I said yes. She then sent me a series of videos from the last series of fashion talks, which were highly thought-provoking, and I was honoured to have been asked to join such a group of speakers. However, now I was not only lacking a degree in fashion, but also a PhD and a published book. So intimidated was the word that came to mind. Thanks, Renate. But no, joking aside, I believe I'm here today to speak with you about my methodology. And this is not a product solely of my education, but draws from all types of disciplines and experiences. The fact that Renate invited me to speak in itself is an act of interdisciplinary engagement, an approach that is key to my practice. So really, I couldn't say no. So I want to introduce hunter-gatherer in the Anthropocene. This project I embarked on whilst still at university about 5 years ago. And the reason I've chosen to talk about this first, as opposed to a more recent project, is that in many ways it encapsulates the way that I work in its raw state, without needing to be based in a real-world context. I used university as an experimental space to create and think in a way that I guess I didn't think would be possible once I left university, needing to generate an income, etc. Ironically, the experimental, unrealistic project that evolved became a manifesto for my professional practice. So I'm now just going to try and attempt to share my screen with you. So hunter-gatherer in the Anthropocene is a speculative design project that applies a hunter-gatherer mindset to the issues of our time. The objects that I've created are responses to the unique threats posed by this world of the Anthropocene, and my research explored 3 of the disconnects that characterize this epoch. Firstly, the abundance of waste materials that exist outside of our natural ecosystems. The second is the loss of cultural narratives and the creation of homogenized archaeologies caused by the global standardization of our material world. And this leads to the third disconnect, the loss of practical resourcefulness caused by an overdependency on technology. These disconnects speak to the loss of the hands-on, of knowledge and understanding, of skills, of craft, and with that, culture. And what it means to, this becomes hard to relate to when so many of us no longer have any part in the making of the objects that we own. So to explore these artifacts, I created a series of artifacts that provide critical, experimental, and speculative insights into the evolving human relationships with the natural environment. My research was both practical and Barry Lopez, not to mention the hundreds of National Geographical articles I consumed during the project. And I'm briefly going to read you a quote by George Monbiot, which really, for me, captures an element of these disconnects and how they come about. So he writes, "It is no longer rare to meet an adult who has never swum except in a swimming pool, never slept except in a building, never been stung by a bee or a wasp, broken a bone, or needed stitches. Without a visceral knowledge, we lose our reference points. We are separated from the world by a layer of glass. Climate change, distant wars, the erosion of democracy, the resurgence of fascism, in our temperature-controlled enclosures, all can be reduced to abstractions." I wanted to create a project that existed at the meeting place between design and anthropology, and this touches on an interdisciplinary approach, which I'll go into more later. But I decided to set the the project in the context of a National Geographical style article as a character living alongside consumers and utilizing their waste streams. This enabled me to comment on and document, I guess, the cultures and rituals that evolved throughout this process. Framing the project within this well-known and understood format provided a lens through which to view and engage with the work, where the connections between designer and product became more human and artifact. So the materials might be new, but the mindset I would apply to them would be about 2.5 million years old. And in order for this project to work, I couldn't be viewing this character from the outside. For a project focusing on disconnect, this would be far too detached. So I had to become this individual, building this relationship with these materials, and in doing so, I had to rewild my design process. Forage for materials, move outside of the workshop, engage with intuitive making processes. I had to become this hunter-gatherer. So my material choices were dictated by what was available within walking distance and by abundance of material, the same as our ancestors. However, based in Brighton, there was a lot less antelope and birch bark and a lot more coffee shops. So they became my hunting ground and provided me with my materials. Milk bottles, coffee bags, egg boxes, flour bags, and I also foraged within the local area and found coppiced sycamore, waste metal, and rubber from the inner bike tires. As a maker, or perhaps craftsman is a better word in this context, I'm drawn to natural materials, to wood, fibers, stone, clay. They have an animism. No two stones or pieces of wood, for example, are the same. They're part of the natural world, just like us. However, processed synthetic materials such as plastics, they're different and they didn't naturally engage me, so I was going to have to work at it. And for a start, I didn't like plastic, so it was going to be a challenge. I felt practically I could create something with these materials. But could I inject them with animism, realize their value, and illustrate their potential as materials with emotional durability? Could I fall in love with these materials? And the answer, of course, was yes, in just the same way that our ancestors learned the history-changing potential of flint, by experimenting, shaping, and molding, by developing a skill set, cultivating knowledge and language, and a language of craft around them. So I had to define the materials of the Anthropocene, ask where do I find them? How do I hunt them, process, and prepare them? There are hundreds of books on working with wood, but I can assure you the same cannot be said for HDPE, which is the plastic which milk bottles are made from. But if I could fall a bit in love with milk bottles, despite smelling like rancid milk for the entire duration of the project, I felt like anyone could. And as I worked with these bottles, finding the best way to cut them to get the most out of each bottle, separating the thicker and thinner plastics, heat pressing them into sheets, and laboriously heating the sheets into bigger sheets and creating seams between them, these what I assumed to be lifeless, homogeneous objects started to take on a life of their own. They became the animal skins of the Anthropocene. To stop seeing these items purely as trash, I had to get to know them based on their material properties, as opposed to their previous function. The qualities would then decide that function. So the kayak came about as a kind of physical research vehicle, a reference point from which to work. And while in many ways a kayak is an ancient object that was first used around 4,000 years ago, It has a timelessness to it, and it could traverse the rising sea levels predicted in this world of the Anthropocene, leaving no trace. It seemed like a natural choice. So the frame of the kayak was made using copper sycamore, a waste material that was being cut down in a local woodland. And not the best wood for bending, I'll admit, but with some failures and testing of breaking points, it became possible. An underlying ethos that set the tone for much of the making process is the mindset of useful. The idea that everything has a use, you just have to find it. So Barry Lopez speaks at length about this in his book Arctic Dreams, where he comments on how within Inuit culture, every part of the animal is used, from skin to bone to fat. So I'm going to read a quote from him. The Inuit utilized the caribou completely. They made clothing, bedding, and bags from its skin, tools and weapons from its bone and antlers, noting that the fats in the caribou leg joints congealed at lower temperatures the further they were from the body core. They took the fat from the foot and used it as a lubricant for bowstrings in freezing temperatures. They used the marrow of the bone for fuel, its blood in glues, its sinews for lashings and bindings, and thread. So, in order to prove the value of these waste objects I was using, I decided that once I'd chosen a waste object, I would waste nothing. Within our human history, this is an ethos born out of necessity, a fight for survival. And for those of us in positions of privilege, we no longer encounter this need every day. But resourcefulness and a mindset of useful are incredibly important tools. They're in forms of activism, and they have the potential to change our 24/7 consumer culture. The kayak paddle required a harder material for the paddle blades. And so for this, I employed a technology first documented about 4000 BC, and that's casting. Only I wouldn't be casting metal, I'd be casting plastic. So I used the harder sections of the milk bottles that were unsuitable for the skin. And by carving a wooden mold, I could heat this plastic, which has a very low melting point, and cast it. And it gave me a solid bone-like material, which was perfect for the blades of a paddle. It became evident fairly quickly that due to working with unconventional materials, I would not only need to develop my own techniques, but also tools in order to process and work with these materials. I researched the different blades that have come about throughout human history, from the early flint to the ulu knife, which is a rounded blade with a handle on top, still used among Inuit communities and passed down through the generations of women. I find needed to cut milk bottles. So for this, I used recycled metal, and the bone-like qualities of HDPE were perfect for the handle. The wooden frame of the kayak required the bark to be stripped off, and stripping bark requires a draw knife. The woodland where the sycamore was sourced that was located on a piece of land that has long been used as a dumping ground, and this provided me with a harvesting opportunity. The circular shaped brake plates provided a perfect blade for a draw knife. This came from a motorbike which had been lying there for however many years, and I decided to wrap the handle of the draw knife in the inner tire of the same bike, which reduced rubbing on the palm of the hand. As you will well know, skins and furs that have long been used throughout our history to cover us were once part of living, breathing animals, and this gives them remarkable qualities that demand respect and require specific knowledge around the preparation and working of the material. Clothing for a hunter-gatherer in the Anthropocene needs to be kayak-worthy, waterproof, and flexible enough to move about in. For trousers, the flour bag offers a lightweight material that is warm enough and fairly and moves with the human body, I soon found. So it can also be waxed, which gives it this waterproof finish. And despite it being man-made, its qualities echo that of a natural animal skin or oil skin. Coffee bags are a nightmare within the traditional recycling system, as they're composed of 3 different materials fused together, and that's plastic, paper, and metal foil. However, this provided a perfect material for a waterproof jacket, as it's durable, waterproof, and retains warmth. I found that the coffee bags can also be fused together using heat, creating a really waterproof seam. I also needed a vessel or a bag to carry the materials that I was gathering. And so experimentation with egg trays resulted in this durable, lightweight material. I realized it was possible to make a binder from the remaining flour in the bottom of the flour bags that I'd used for the trousers. And this binder could be mixed with the egg boxes to create a dough, which can be shaped and then dried out to form a hard shell, which was stitched together using electrical wiring. Cultural objects might not seem to have an obvious function, but they're vastly significant in creating and responding to a community's cultural identity. Within human history, these objects or drawings often mimic local wildlife. They become a framework for the cultural, and this became a framework for the cultural objects of the Anthropocene. Wait, sorry. Milk bottles and flour bags were used to create these playful objects that were unrefined and designed not to be a replica of an animal, but to capture the essence, childlike, think cave paintings, for example. It's interesting to consider the impact of these objects as a storytelling tool in really creating this world of the Anthropocene. And while the other artifacts have an obvious use, these material animals begins to suggest how the hunter-gatherers might view and interpret their world, in the same way that archaeological artifacts help us build an image of our ancestors and what their lives, routines, and rituals may have been like. So this project did not aim to glorify the hunter-gatherer existence, nor did it suggest everyone start building milk bottle kayaks. But we have spent thousands of years refining hands-on skills and knowledge and have created a resourcefulness and resilience that has ensured our survival to date. So this project asks, how now in the 21st century, with all the new tools of industrialization and globalization and technology, can we reintroduce this mindset of resourcefulness and re-engage with our planet? So this was hunter-gatherer in the Anthropocene. And I'm just gonna try and stop sharing my screen with you now. As previously mentioned, this project continues to evolve and inform my practice, both in the values that are embedded in my work and the tools that I use to create it. And these can be broken down into 4 elements. So narrative and animism, resourcefulness and the mindset of useful, embracing the interdisciplinary, and knowledge and skill exchange. Conveniently, these tools and values happen to be, in my mind, intrinsically linked to the overriding themes of this series of talks, between consumption, criticism, and animism. I'm just going to reference back to the word animism on the off chance that anyone doesn't understand the meaning of it. Animism is the belief that in the spirit that inanimate objects and materials have. It's their presence and how they relate to each other and how we relate to them and connect to them. Animism is connected to some of our oldest belief systems as humans and is still practiced by indigenous people around the world. It provides an antidote to our disconnection from the natural world, in my mind, and discovering the concept of animism has been fundamental to my practice. And so I use it to question, can we inject animism into materials and objects as a way to find and build value and emotional connection? So we might look at an individual and think, wow, what a beautiful person. And we can be seduced by looks the way we can with objects. But it's their story, the character, the flaws, the obscurities that make us fall in love with a human. And I would argue this is in some ways not so different with an object. It holds more meaning once we build a relationship with it, know its surfaces. A garment of clothing, for example, holds emotional value once we have worn it, and it has clothed us through experiences, good and bad. It becomes part of the fabric of our narrative, no pun intended. This changes our relationship and perception of the garment. Using animism and engaging narrative challenges over consumption. It has an ability to create critical reflections and is a form of activism, a counterweight to the homogeneous and mass-produced, to the spiritless. I would argue that if we had a genuine connection or need for each of the objects that we chose to have in our lives, we might have far fewer objects that hold far more value on both a practical and emotional level. As you guys are well aware, the culture of repair is returning within the clothing industries and slowly other material object-based industries. And before, it may have come from a need, but now from a growing understanding of resources and a stand against exploitative industries. It creates objects and garments that we carry with us for longer, and in doing so, cultivates an emotional durability. The culture of the handmade and craft has a significant role to play in the creation of objects with animism. I could probably learn a lot from fashion communication when it comes to the importance of context and framing. But I'd like to share a recent experience with you that highlighted this importance for me. Harvest is a series of artifacts that apply traditional craft techniques to contemporary waste materials. And it's a project that was born out of being invited by Oslo Design Fair to create and exhibit a project that is a continuation of the Hunter-Gatherer project as part of an inspiration showcase at the Design Fair this year. Similarly to Hunter-Gatherer, it also highlights the potential of resourcefulness and questions the role that endangered craft practices could play in our future. Harvest refers both to the method of material collection and from waste bags across the city and the purpose of the finished objects. The series consists of baskets and nets and vessels which are both utilitarian and ambiguous, hinting at equipment designed for harvesting the crops of the future, hopefully a regenerative future. Harvest merges the human-powered harvesting and craft techniques of the past with technology and materials of the present and future. So narrative is key to understanding these objects. And this is a very brief overview, giving you an idea of how I envisaged the communication of the project. And now I'm going to show you an image of the presentation and how it was presented at the fair. So I think we can agree, in the context of a commercial design fair among furniture and homeware, the objects lost their meaning. And this is okay, because I knew this might happen, but I was keen to test it. This series of work will be exhibited in October with the same curator, but in a gallery where imagery and narrative will be highlighted, so all is not lost. But I'm just going to stop sharing my screen with you. I've already spoken about resourcefulness in the context of the Hunter-Gatherer project, but I just want to touch upon it in relation to the themes of this talk series, where resourcefulness becomes a quiet form of activism that allows us to navigate around systems and expected behaviours, helping us to make conscious choices about what to engage with and consume. It's an empowering tool to apply to situations both within creative industries and life in general. I naturally gravitate towards waste materials when it comes to making, not just because I'm stingy about buying materials, but because of the potential I see in them and the challenge that they present. Working with waste is a fantastic exercise in resourcefulness, and it trains this mindset of useful. So I landed on design as my discipline of choice because I naturally seem to process the world through my hands. And it also seemed a way to feed a curious mind. Like many others I know, I have too many interests, far more interests than it is possible to study in a lifetime. But design provides an opportunity to engage with these disciplines through collaborations, be it with urban planners, anthropologists, marine biologists, social scientists, etc., etc. A process where I get to learn and also share my knowledge. These encounters aren't always comfortable, and stepping out of our cozy world means engaging with others who may be engaging with the same topics from a very different angle or with a different language. It leaves less room for assuming things that we don't know and far more room for the realization that we know very little on certain topics. I find it fascinating to attend events that call themselves open, but are hosted and aimed at a particular demographic. So over the last years, I've been to environmental events where I was the only designer, some hosted by politicians and policymakers, others by universities, academics, and the humanities sector, some by environmentalists, and I learned a lot. But I also experienced that being the only designer there as a visitor, not a speaker, that assumptions were being made about the role of designers within the topics discussed, and they were often wrong and going unquestioned. And no one had invited a designer to speak on behalf of the discipline. Differing perspectives and diversity are so incredibly valuable to creating well-rounded, successful projects, solutions, and humans for that matter. As it was previously mentioned, I'm also an arborist, so I care for trees in the urban context. And falling into and then deciding to pursue this second career is an ongoing negotiation. And I still question if doing both makes it possible to do either as well as I would like, or if I'll be taken seriously in either. But the idea that you can only be successful in something if you're devoting your whole life to it is, in my opinion, outdated. These labors of love, for use of a better word, create a symbiosis with each other and my needs, and in doing so become more of a lifestyle than professions. Becoming an arborist has diversified my life and my design practice and given me the opportunity to be critical and invite criticism. So within my tree work, I work with a group of individuals who have no background in design or other creative practices. And when these people ask about the projects I have going on, I'm forced to find a language that communicates what I do to someone who isn't another designer. This is uncomfortable and not always successful. And when I get it wrong, it alienates the other person. But if I can get it right, I can create an environment that invites curiosity and a space where no question is stupid. This not only results in an understanding, but it also enables them to ask genuine questions about my practice that I may never have thought to ask myself. It makes me think and encourages me to be critical. They become my bullshit barometer, for use of a better word. I've also found that when describing my practice to a tree worker, I use our common ground as a resource. So I relate the way that I work with design to examples within tree work. Drawing these parallels between disciplines has helped me not only communicate, but acknowledge my natural design process and lean into what I call intuitive making. So let me give you an example. When I approach a tree, I analyze it with my toolbox of skills and knowledge, different climbing techniques, where best to apply each, how the weather and conditions might affect the climb, how the type of tree will alter the technique, which technique is and isn't safe. A mental planning process goes on. I then make sure that I won't need the toilet for a couple of hours and climb the tree. And the result is that the rest involves muscle memory, knowledge-based intuition, flow, and often the need to adjust and reevaluate during the climb where elements that were not clear from the ground reveal themselves. This process is in many ways a reflection of my practical application of my design work. For example, when handed a pile of waste, I assess the situation, use my knowledge on how different materials work, their properties, etc., as explained in the Hunter-Gatherer project. And then I plan a little and start making a process-driven approach, letting the materials and my eye and hands intuitively direct the outcome, adjusting when conditions change and new properties of the materials present themselves, but trusting my instincts. Also, engaging other sets of eyes to aid the process in the same way that I do when working in a tree. So, tree work gave me permission to engage with the way that I naturally create. Leading on from the importance of the interdisciplinary approach, I'm going to talk a little about some of the social and community-based design work that I'm involved with, and the emphasis of skill and knowledge exchange. So I'm currently collaborating with a small group of individuals to establish a space dedicated to regenerative practices. The project is called Lekta, which is the Norwegian word for barge, and it will be a floating space on the Oslo fjord, situated in the last undeveloped area of Oslo's waterfront. And it'll be built around a multidisciplinary approach with the aim of creating an active, knowledge-dense environment that enables symbiotic partnerships and the reconnection between Oslo and its inhabitants with the Oslo fjord and its biodiversity. It's a space for storytelling, for scientific studies, a testing site. It's a space where we may reintroduce kelp into the Oslo fjord to stimulate biodiversity. It's for mapping, documenting, communicating data. We'll invite different people from all paths of life to come and occupy this space under the premise of engaging with a regenerative practice through the lens of their specific profession. There is a framework, but it is an experimental project. And the results are unpredictable. There is a tension that's created by asking scientists and artists and NGOs and companies to share space, and inviting and managing the tension can lead to some of the most innovative solutions. The space also challenges traditional urban planning and asks if urban development and biodiversity can form a symbiosis, or if one will always come at the cost of another. As part of this project, I returned to the method of rewilding the design process and undertook a research trip that involved 200 kilometers of solo kayaking, engaging with and researching a section of Glomma, Norway's longest river, and the full length of the Oslo fjord. And I returned feeling pretty crusty with sea salt, and with a significantly more intimate relationship with the subject matter. Sharing our knowledge and skills is such a simple but simultaneously radical act. It consolidates the interdependent as opposed to independent and reinforces a community-centered perspective. As a hands-on person, I often take for granted my ability to make things. But in the last years, I've worked with projects which invite locals in districts of Oslo to design their own modifications on outdoor social spaces. So we facilitate the design process and then guide the construction, teaching people how to use drills and saws And for many, it's the first time they've ever picked up a power tool. And here, the sharing of the hands-on becomes a tool of empowerment, of confidence building, and the result is joyous. There is a new feeling of ownership and pride over the space, and an inclination to use and care for it. Skills have been exchanged and a sense of community reinforced. It's interesting to acknowledge that sometimes the most powerful use of our skills is in the sharing of them. And not to mention, promoting and celebrating a culture of skill sharing is an FU to a culture of overconsumption and capitalism. None of the subjects that I've touched upon within this talk are new. Many of them have been key elements in the evolution of our species. The use of narrative, resourcefulness, a hands-on relationship with materials and their natural environment. These reinforce our place as part of a far, far larger ecosystem. Making and storytelling don't start once we study a subject. I do not believe that I have a label that says designer and therefore I make, but I make because I'm human. And these skills and knowledge are deeply embedded and built into the fabric of our humanity. So I guess I'd like to leave you with these thoughts of embracing discomfort within your practice, because it's probably teaching us something. Aim to manage and utilize the tension created by interdisciplinary connections as opposed to avoiding it. And resourcefulness is powerful. So now I'd like to open up the conversation and make this an exchange as opposed to a one-way lecture. Thank you for engaging in this quiet form of activism with me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zoe, for sharing this with us. I think you so brilliantly said, you know, sometimes the most powerful use of our skills is in the sharing. So thank you so much for sharing your journey and your skills. So we open for questions now, and I have an immediate question because you pointed out at the beginning, you know, you don't have a PhD or you don't have that sort of academic background. At the same time, I would call your practice very much a critical practice that uses, you know, theoretical texts and concepts and writings to interrogate materials and processes. And I wonder how you would say you've arrived at this practice.
Interesting. I think it comes from kind of a base in having, in some ways, too many interests, and finding constant connections between things, and finding that the things that I was reading in my spare time were automatically connecting to thoughts that I'd had within my design work, and kind of, instead of putting out you know, my spare time and what I did there from what was happening at university or within projects, or finding ways to build these connections, and in doing so kind of create these projects which ended up being far more than just making or just a more research-based project in terms of sitting and reading, but all of the different practices kind of ended up informing each other and enable to see that I make through reading articles, and I think I just find that process incredibly exciting, and I think I was lucky enough to attend a university which encouraged that approach, and where I was on, in many ways, quite a multidisciplinary course, and this kind of connection between engaging a more theoretical approach and the more hands-on was encouraged, and a kind of yeah, just a reinforcement that nothing kind of works in isolation. And so I'm not sure I can totally pinpoint an exact moment where this became my practice, but I think just, yeah, naturally pulling things together and talking with many friends, I believe, also, who come from very different backgrounds, and speaking with them about my ideas and my work and having them do the same, and realizing that in many ways a lot of us are talking about the same thing despite our backgrounds, and how can we use them to inform each other and build richer projects, I guess, and solutions. If that answers something.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. You know, so often we're either relegated to the so-called practice or the so-called theory. You know, either the word or the image, or the word or the craft practice. And I think finding that your theorizing is also a form of practice, and practice can, you know, theorize. I think that crossover I find particularly fascinating and inspiring in your work. Thank you. I want to open up to questions. Are there any questions in the room? Emily.
I just wanted to know, you said that you, at a very young age, you realized that you were drawn to raw materials. And I kind of relate to that feeling of figuring out what you want at a young age and sticking with it. So I was just wondering, like, what was that realization like for you?
I guess it's very connected to identity, and kind of I'm incredibly lucky in that I grew up in a place where I had a very strong connection to my natural environment, and grew up in a farming district of the south of England, and had a very hands-on interaction with where my food came from, and the local farming industries, and helping with lambing and slaughtering and these kind of processes, and equally with then making processes and kind of cutting down willow and making things out of it. And I think, I don't know if there was a moment where there was a realization that happened. In some ways, actually, oddly enough, I think I had more of a realization that this was so connected to my identity when I started doing something different, when I started doing tree work, because suddenly I had a bit of an identity crisis. Because I think making and having a relationship to kind of raw materials had been such a natural part of me, that suddenly, even though you know, working with trees is in many ways, and I have come to realize, a very natural kind of progression of me. I think initially it caused a bit of a crisis, because I was suddenly like, I'd been placing a lot of my identity within the designer and within this relationship that I had with natural materials, and then suddenly I was pulling myself out of that environment which I felt comfortable in, and placing myself in another world, which soon became home in itself, because I was just had access to a whole load of more natural materials in the waste that we produce from tree work. But yeah, I think it's hard to pinpoint a moment about when that kind of formed, I guess, for me. Maybe it was a real that realization in some ways, that when I was pulled out of my life.
Thank you. And Sarah, I think you had a question.
Hello. Well, first I want to say thank you, that I find your connection with nature and your relationship with nature very inspiring. As somebody who has never been stung by a bee or broken a bone, that's something that I always want to feel like I need to work on, is that connection with nature. But I guess what I wanted to know is, on this subject of, you said interdisciplinary practice. When you were doing this project, did you ever think of it in terms of scaling it on the production environment, or do you think that getting into the hunter-gatherer mindset and the intimate relationship you had to form with your materials, you had to put that aside completely? And if not, or if so, do you think that this type of project, this kind of design project, is incompatible with the capitalist society that we live in? It's kind of a loaded question. Sorry.
Thank you. When you just quickly, when you mention kind of a scaling up, are you talking about turning it into a more of a production in terms of like taking
using recyclable materials? Yeah, like using recyclable materials in the way that you do.
Yeah. I think I definitely questioned. I mean, there are so many examples of incredible projects and initiatives which use recycled materials in so many different ways. And I think I struggled actually with where to kind of place my project initially, in terms of that, because I realized that in some ways I'm not a natural product designer, and so I kind of, the idea of creating a series of objects, for example, which I could sell, which were made from recycled materials, or could then even go into more factory style production, something that interested me, but I didn't know quite how to place myself in it. And I think what I came to realize is that for me, this project was very much about challenging the way we operate with materials on kind of an individual level, and so one of the hopes I had for this project, which ironically didn't work out, but has kind of played out in different ways now with these more interdisciplinary projects that I'm involved in, and more kind of social and community-based projects, is taking this project on a journey, on kind of a physical journey, and holding workshops and talks with people. And at that point, it was in the UK, and I was looking at kind of the London canal system and using the kayak to navigate this canal system, and hold discussions with people along the way, and invite them into this world with these different, and share this knowledge around these specific materials, just as a way to kind of break down it's so easy, and I do it all the time. I kind of pick up a piece of packaging from my fridge, and that is, it's intrinsically like, oh yes, and now that goes in the bin. And so I guess what I was in so many ways trying to do is kind of just spark that question of if we can create, a milk bottle kayak, what can we do with these materials? And I don't think it's necessarily I'm not sure in some ways, I guess, to be absolutely honest, about the relation, whether this way of working, or this kind of more narrative driven approach is compatible with capitalism. I think there's a balance that has to be found, and I think in some ways this approach of understanding this abundance of waste materials that we have in a different way, and potentially utilizing them and feeding them into into the kind of maybe more traditional way that we make things, and adapting factories and things to use waste materials more, which is already happening in so many examples. I think that's a step, and I guess my work is more the narrative side of that, and the communication of that, and the kind of changing the minds, working on changing the mindsets and around the materials, less than the kind of practical application on a scaling up. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there further questions? Leah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation.
I've just lost.
Really? That's crazy. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's
Okay. I said thank you for your presentation. It was beautiful and full of information. Um, I was gonna ask you about animism, and I know that it has a huge connection to indigenous cultures around the world. Um, and I just wanted to know if you've ever researched the indigenous people of Oslo, and if you ever come across them in your work, because I know you're also work with trees and nature, and just like if you've got a chance to connect with them, because you talked about like the loss of cultural narrative and how we need to integrate that into our everyday practices in order to become more sustainable.
absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. Since moving to Norway, my awareness of Sami culture has grown exponentially, and is something that very much still in the process of finding one as a foreigner to Norway. Um, so yeah, as yeah, approaching a different language. But it's interesting you should ask, because while I have exhibitions and talks and things held by the community within Oslo, a project that I'm currently looking into with among kind of along with others is a research trip to the north of Norway, which has a bigger population of the local of the Sami community, and looking at learning kind of starting conversations about the skills that are important to them and the knowledge that's important to them, and this and it's a sensitive topic. These issues are kind of coming in as an outsider, but maybe using design and making and craft as a meeting point of minds and a point for discussion. So yeah, I'm very interested in the local indigenous community, and looking to kind of connect more moving forward as some of these projects that I'm working on right now start to move forward.
Thank you. I think Natalie, you had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering with the plastics, now I'm not too educated on the, I guess, chemistry of plastics, but when you were using the milk bottles and you mentioned at the maximum heating point, but when you do that, does it release more microplastics, or what's the environmental impact of the second use?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, that was something I looked into in depth, because I was obviously the last thing that was going to be beneficial was creating a negative effect from heating the plastics. And I was lucky enough to be based in a department which had a lot of knowledge in Brighton University around plastics and research around recycling plastics. And there's a melting point of a plastic and then a burning point of a plastic, and you can heat a plastic, especially plastics with very low melting points. These plastics melt. I can't actually now physically remember exactly what the melting point is of HDPE, but it's remarkably low. And so in that process, I was initially worried about not so much the release of microplastics necessarily, but the release of fumes. But found through being lucky enough to have access to many mines in the at Brighton University, and also through experimentation, that if you heat up to the melting point, that's absolutely safe and nothing is released. And the plastic still changes form and becomes not liquid, but it becomes pressable. And then if you heat up to the burning point, that's a point when it actually risks catching fire and absolutely releasing toxic smoke. So it's it becomes a somewhat scientific process of making, in some ways, and understanding these different properties of the material. That was a lot of research went into that to make sure that there were no negative impacts of what I was doing in that sense.
Well, thank you.
I think, Alon, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for sharing that information with us. I was just wondering, because I also found the stuff about animism super important, and I thought that it was powerful, but also that you were making some kind of bold claims that I had wondered if you'd ever been challenged about, particularly that animism might lead to less consumption overall and that people would have less things. I was just wondering, like, have you like considered at all, like I'm thinking of like hoarding and OCD and a scenario where people do ascribe meaning to more things, ascribe more meaning to their things, but then they also, since we live in an consumptionist consumption era, that they would buy more things and then ascribe more meaning to more things and then just have more and more things. So I was just wondering if that ever comes up at all, or
yeah, that's it. And it's something that I'm aware of, definitely, and we all relate so differently to objects and have such different relationships with objects. And thank you for pointing that out, because the research I've done has been mainly into these working in a more minimalistic way, and the impact that having an emotional connection with something can create, and the impact of animism. But of course, that's absolutely a good point, and something which, thank you for bringing it up, because I will do more research on. And it's been something which I've been aware of, and that there are these very different relationships, and of course hoarding and OCD and different very different relationships with physical matter that different individuals, different cultures, different communities have. And I think my personal relationship with physical matter, I guess, is I've kind of broken it down into a very a somewhat kind of rational or potentially over rational, when it comes down to kind of a need or an emotional connection based on carrying an object through an experience with you. So yeah, I will take that forward as a learning point and do my research on it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's also going back to the title of your project, Hunter-Gatherer in the Anthropocene. And today, it's the second time I'm lucky enough to engage with your work. And today it suddenly struck me that you're doing so much, it's so much more than hunting and gathering, which really are also forms of consumption. But what you're doing, or what makes this so inspiring and I think important, the work, is that you're then making and crafting and designing. And so anyway, going back to the title of this work, how come in a way you focused on that stage and not the creative stage?
I'm not sure I totally understood the question. I'm sorry.
So the title of your work is Hunter-Gatherer in the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
And to me, that's only really the very beginning of this work that you're doing. And then really the work begins, because you're transforming and you're making and you're crafting. And so I wonder, how did you decide on the title and focus on that very fast stage rather than the creative stage?
I think it all kind of, I don't think the project necessarily evolved in totally the way that I now see it. And so I think it was based initially, very much in a practical, like I say, I'm someone who engages with the world very much through making. So I think the initial initial process was very making based and experimental, and I think I had a drive to kind of challenge my perception of waste as an individual and what was possible with it. And then I think I started to understand that there are these rituals and ways that I was, I would turn up to the same coffee shop at a certain time each day, knowing that they would put the waste out at that time and that these materials would be there, and the kind of, this like I described, these rituals and processes which evolved, which I started to kind of draw correlations with this more anthropological narrative. And so I think it kind of, the two, the kind of physical and practical application then started to take on a different meaning. And then I started to kind of explore the more theoretical and do more research. And so there was a lot of material experimentation, which was impossible to squeeze into this presentation. And that was before the objects that are now kind of became the final objects, before they evolved. So I guess, it was very much a start from practical and then became this methodological and more narrative driven. So that was the kind of, evolution of how that came about, I guess.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I think this is all we have time for today, but I want to thank you really for this important and inspiring reminder that we can process the world not only through our eyes, as it's often done in forms of consumption, but really through our many senses, also our ears, our skin, but also our hands, that can be so empowering and creates that sense of community. So thank you very much for sharing that with us so vividly tonight. And thank you all for coming and for your great questions. Keep safe, and we're looking forward to the rest of the series throughout the year. Thank you very much, Zoe.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for the opportunity to talk and the questions. It's been, very interesting. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you, we will. We're moving over to the Seine now so we can talk without masks. But have a really nice evening outside of Oslo. And I think we'll make sure that next time you're in Paris, we invite you into this building and can share a conversation in one room.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Take care.
Enjoy your evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.